On the morning of December 7, 1941, the American Pacific Fleet lay sleeping in the waters of Pearl Harbor. By noon, it would be burning. 353 Japanese aircraft descended from the clouds in two devastating waves. The USS Arizona exploded, taking 1,177 men with her. The Oklahoma capsized, trapping 400 sailors inside her steel tomb. By the time the smoke cleared, 2,403 Americans were dead. 8 battleships lay destroyed or damaged. And President Franklin Delano Roosevelt stood before Congress to declare December 7th a date which will live in infamy. For 8 decades, this has been the story, an unprovoked surprise attack. Japanese treachery. A peaceful nation stabbed in the back while its diplomats spoke of peace in Washington. The attack that forced isolationist America into World War II. But here's what they don't teach you in history class. Washington had broken Japan's diplomatic codes 8 months earlier. American intelligence was reading every encrypted message between Tokyo and its embassies. Economic sanctions had been systematically tightening around Japan's throat for over a year. And on that Sunday morning, America's 3 newest aircraft carriers, the future of naval warfare, were conveniently hundreds of miles away from Pearl Harbor. This is the story of how Pearl Harbor wasn't a surprise. It was checkmate announced in advance. To understand what really happened on December 7th, you need to understand Japan's fatal weakness. By the late 1930s, Japan had transformed itself into a modern industrial power. It had built a formidable military. It controlled Korea, Manchuria, and large portions of coastal China. To the outside world, Japan looked like a rising empire. But beneath that facade was a structural vulnerability that made Japan completely dependent on a single nation, the United States. Japan had virtually no natural resources. Zero domestic oil production. 80% of Japan's oil came from American companies. 90% of its scrap iron and steel. 75% of its machine tools. Japan's entire war machine ran on American fuel, American steel, and American machinery. Every battleship, every tank, every aircraft built with resources that flowed from ports in California and Texas, and after 1937, Japan was burning through those resources at a terrifying rate. The invasion of China had turned into a brutal quagmire. Japanese forces controlled the coast but faced endless resistance inland. The occupation was consuming 12,000 barrels of oil every single day just to maintain control. Japan's military was stuck in an unwinnable war, bleeding resources it didn't have, entirely dependent on supplies from the nation that would soon become its greatest enemy. By 1940, everyone understood the contradiction. American corporations, Standard Oil, U.S. Steel, General Motors were profiting enormously from both sides. They sold to Japan, they sold to China. And in Washington, the Roosevelt administration watched this dependency with great interest. Because when you control 80% of someone's oil supply, you don't just have leverage, you have a noose. July 26, 1940, President Roosevelt signs the Export Control Act into law. On paper, it's a simple authorization giving the executive branch power to restrict the export of strategic materials during times of international tension. In practice, it's a loaded weapon aimed directly at Japan's industrial heart. 2 months later, September 1940, the first restrictions go into effect. Scrap iron and steel exports to Japan are embargoed. The public justification is moral outrage over Japanese aggression in China. American values cannot support Japanese militarism. We must take a stand for democracy and human rights. But behind closed doors in Washington, a very different conversation is taking place. Roosevelt's Cabinet Secretary of War Henry Stimson, Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox, Secretary of State Cordell Hull, they're all reading the same map. Europe is burning. Hitler controls France, the Low Countries, Poland, Czechoslovakia. Britain stands alone, being bombed nightly, running out of money to continue the war. And American public opinion is decisively isolationist. 80% of Americans oppose sending troops to another European conflict. The memory of World War I is too fresh, too bitter, but there's a back door. Japan has signed the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy. If Japan attacks American interests, Germany is treaty-bound to declare war. And if Germany declares war on America, the isolationist problem solves itself. The question, as Stimson writes in his diary, is how to maneuver Japan into firing the first shot without appearing to be the aggressor ourselves. Economic pressure provides the perfect tool. Embargo their resources, force them to choose between complete capitulation or seizing alternative supplies in Southeast Asia. When they move south toward British and Dutch colonies, you have your provocation. When they strike back at American interference, you have your Pearl Harbor. This was the original sin. The deliberate engineering of a crisis that could then be framed as unprovoked aggression. With the first embargo in place, Washington watched Japan's reaction carefully. Would they back down? Would they withdraw from China, accept American demands, return to being a compliant trading partner? They did not. Instead, Japan did exactly what the strategic planners predicted. In September 1940, Japanese forces moved into northern French Indochina, securing airfields and supply routes. The stated purpose was to cut off supply lines to Chinese resistance forces. The real purpose was to position themselves closer to the resources they would need if American supplies dried up completely. And American supplies were drying up systematically, month by month. October 1940, aviation fuel exports restricted. Japan's strategic reserves begin declining. December 1940, iron ore and pig iron added to the embargo list. January 1941, copper and brass exports halted. Each restriction was announced with moral justification. Each tightened the noose another inch. But here's what made this strangulation possible: Operation MAGIC. In August 1940, American cryptanalysts had broken Japan's most sophisticated diplomatic cipher, codenamed Purple. From that moment forward, Washington could read virtually every message flowing between Tokyo and Japanese embassies around the world. The Roosevelt administration was reading Japan's internal deliberations in real time. They knew how desperate Tokyo was becoming. They knew oil reserves were dropping. They knew the imperial military was calculating how long they could sustain operations. By early 1941, Japan had 55 million barrels of oil in reserve. Sound like a lot? It wasn't. Japan was burning through 40,000 barrels per day for military operations alone. At that rate, reserves would last barely 3 years, and if they went to war, 6 months. Maybe. Tokyo understood the mathematics perfectly. They were on a countdown clock. Either secure alternative oil sources, the Dutch East Indies, British Malaya, or submit completely to American dominance. Withdraw from China, dismantle the empire. Accept permanent second-tier status in Asia. The moment of maximum pressure came on July 26, 1941. Japan, hoping to strengthen its position for negotiations, moved troops into southern French Indochina. They were now within striking distance of Singapore, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies. Roosevelt's response was immediate and devastating. All Japanese assets in the United States frozen. All oil exports to Japan terminated. A complete economic embargo. This was the kill shot. Japan's oil reserves would now last 18 months in peacetime, 6 months in war. The countdown had begun. And through MAGIC intercepts, Washington watched in real time as Tokyo wrestled with an impossible choice. Japanese diplomatic cables grew increasingly desperate. Proposals were drafted, revised, sent to Washington. In November 1941, Japan offered partial withdrawal from China, recognition of American interests in the Pacific, a return to normal trade relations. The American response came on November 26 in the form of the Hull Note, named for Secretary of State Cordell Hull. The terms were non-negotiable: complete withdrawal from China and Indochina, recognition of the Chiang Kai-shek government. Essentially, abandon everything Japan had fought for over the past decade. The Japanese ambassador in Washington called it an ultimatum. Tokyo's response was blunt: this means war. And in Washington, they knew it. They were reading the cables. They knew war was coming. They knew approximately when. They knew the Japanese fleet had sailed from Kuriil Islands on November 26th, the same day the Hull Note was delivered. The question was no longer if Japan would strike, but where and when. As November 1941 turned into December, curious movements were taking place in the Pacific Fleet. On November 28th, The aircraft carrier USS Lexington departed Pearl Harbor for a mission to Midway Island. On December 5th, the carrier USS Enterprise left to deliver aircraft to Wake Island. The carrier USS Saratoga was in San Diego for repairs and refitting. All three of the Pacific Fleet's modern aircraft carriers, the ships that represented the future of naval warfare, were safely away from Pearl Harbor. Left behind were 8 battleships: the Pennsylvania, the Arizona, the Nevada, the Oklahoma, the West Virginia, the California, the Maryland, the Tennessee. Aging ships from the World War I era, already obsolete in an age where aircraft carriers dominated naval strategy. They sat anchored in neat rows in the harbor, perfect targets, while naval commanders on the ground in Hawaii received vague warnings about possible Japanese action but no specific intelligence about an imminent attack. That intelligence existed. It was in Washington. MAGIC intercepts had revealed that something significant was planned for early December. Reconnaissance reports showed the Japanese fleet had disappeared from its normal positions. A November 27th war warning telegram had been sent to Pacific commands, but it emphasized the Philippines and Southeast Asia as likely targets, not Hawaii. Then came December 7th, at 7:55 a.m. The first wave of Japanese aircraft appeared over Oahu. Dive bombers, torpedo bombers, fighters, 353 aircraft in total. The Arizona exploded when a bomb penetrated her forward magazine, killing 1,177 men instantly. The Oklahoma took 4 torpedoes, capsized, and trapped over 400 sailors in her hull. The West Virginia sank at her moorings. The California flooded and settled to the bottom. The Nevada tried to make a run for open ocean but had to beach herself to avoid sinking in the channel. By 10 a.m., it was over. 2,403 Americans dead. 1,178 wounded. Every battleship in the harbor hit. 5 sunk or sinking. But all 3 aircraft carriers survived. The oil storage facilities, 5 million barrels, enough to fuel the entire Pacific Fleet untouched. The submarine base intact. The repair yards undamaged, almost as if the most valuable assets had been carefully protected. The American public's response was immediate and overwhelming: outrage, fury, demands for revenge. On December 8th, Roosevelt stood before Congress and delivered his infamous speech. The vote for war was nearly unanimous. Overnight, American public opinion shifted from 80% opposed to European involvement to 90% supporting total war. And on December 11th, just as the Tripartite Pact required, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. Roosevelt had his back door to Europe. The isolationist problem was solved, and all it cost was one Sunday morning in Hawaii. In the months and years that followed Pearl Harbor, investigations were launched. Congressional inquiries, military tribunals. The official findings focused on intelligence failures, communication breakdowns, and lack of preparedness. Admiral Husband Kim Il and General Walter Short, the commanders in Hawaii, were relieved of duty and scapegoated for the disaster. But uncomfortable questions lingered beneath the official narrative. Why had Washington's specific intelligence warnings never reached Pearl Harbor commanders? Why were the carriers conveniently absent? Why had the most critical assets survived while obsolete battleships were sacrificed? These questions were raised in congressional hearings in 1945 and 1946, then quietly buried. Documents were classified, testimonies sealed. The official story surprise attack, intelligence failure, became historical fact. The strategic winners were clear. Roosevelt got his war with Germany through the Pacific back door. The military-industrial complex received unlimited budgets and 4 years of total production. American global hegemony was born from the ashes of exhausted European empires. Pearl Harbor unified the nation for total war, enabled massive Lend-Lease expansion to Britain and the Soviet Union, and justified the creation of a permanent national security state that persists to this day. The losers were equally clear. 2,403 American servicemen who died that morning believing they were defending their country, unaware they were pawns in a larger game. Japanese civilians who would ultimately face firebombing and atomic weapons. Millions across Asia and the Pacific who died in a war that might have been avoided entirely. And here's the final irony. Japan's desperate resource grab triggered by the American oil embargo resulted in exactly what they feared most: total defeat, unconditional surrender, and complete American occupation. They became the subordinate state they went to war to avoid becoming. The economic warfare worked perfectly. Japan did exactly what they were maneuvered to do, attacked exactly when and where it served American strategic interests, and provided the perfect justification for a war the American public would never have supported otherwise. Think about that. An entire war, millions of lives, decades of consequences, all set in motion by controlling one resource: oil. The story of Pearl Harbor is the ultimate lesson in how economic warfare manufactures consent for military conflict. When you control someone's oil, you control their choices. When you control their choices, you can force their hand. And when you force their hand, you can play the victim when they swing back. Pearl Harbor wasn't an intelligence failure. It was an intelligence success. Washington got exactly what it engineered: a unified nation, a justified war, an entry into the European conflict through the Pacific backdoor. The attack wasn't a surprise. It was checkmate announced in advance, with 2,403 Americans as acceptable losses in a geopolitical chess game. The tools haven't changed. Economic sanctions, embargoes, resource control, these remain the preferred weapons of modern statcraft. The same playbook gets used again and again. Apply economic pressure, force impossible choices, wait for the desperate response, then claim victimhood when they react exactly as predicted. History isn't written by winners. It's written by those who control what counts as surprise and what counts as inevitable. Pearl Harbor was inevitable from the moment the first oil embargo was signed. Everything that followed was just theater. That's the truth they don't teach in school. But now you know.